toward the morning sun. Underneath the wooden doors there were glass doors. On mild days in winter and early spring, the heavy doors would be folded back to let the sun shine on the glass frames. A short ladder led to the bottom of the pit, where the family's supply of canned fruit was kept on narrow shelves. Besides the food that was so bountifully supplied and so carefully prepared, and the flowers that added their beauty to the place, the home had other attractions. A spirit of hospitality prevailed there, and there was a spirit of understanding and cooperation among those who lived in that house. Moreover, it was a happy home, a place where everyone liked to go, and was reluctant to leave when the time for the visit was over. Uncle Fank's thoughts went beyond his own family and home. He took a deep interest in his neighbors and friends and their affairs. All alike, rich and poor, black and white, were his friends. He was a sociable person. He liked to hobnob with the townfolk. Now and then he would invite one of the men out to hunt on his farm, or on the adjoining farms which belonged to his brothers. One day he had one of the most prominent men in the county seat out for a hunt. The man was wont to take a dram quite often, so he took a flask in his pocket. Up in the morning he got behind a large oak tree so that he would be hidden from Uncle Fant, and took a nip from his bottle. When he turned around, he found himself standing face to face with one of Uncle Fant's nephews, on whose land they were hunting. A little abashed and with a sheepish look, he said, "Don't tell Fant about this." Uncle Fant was a strict teetotaler, and so were all of his sons. Uncle Fant was just as generous with the darkies as he was with the bigwigs when it came to hunting on his land. When they went out at night and their dogs treed a coon high up in the crotch of a tree, they always felt quite free to cut the tree for the coon's hide. No questions were ever asked concerning it, nor did anyone ever go forth at night when Uncle Fant's family heard the barking of the dogs and the sound of the axe as the darkies chopped at the tree. If Uncle Fant had a rule to guide his conduct through life, it must have been, "I want to live my life to the highest extent, and I want to let others live the same way." Chapter 18. The Brown Bottle. It was February. The ground had been covered with snow for several days. Father got up and dressed and built the wood fire in the family room. He made a fire in the kitchen range and fireplace, and then went to the stable to help the hired man feed the stock. Mother dressed and went to the kitchen to cook breakfast. I was sitting before the fire putting on my hand-knit, home-dyed woolen stockings and sturdy calfskin shoes when I heard someone come in the front hall door. It was Uncle Will, my father's oldest brother. When Grandmother was living, he always came to breakfast every other Wednesday morning. After her death, he did not come so often, but we were never surprised when he came in on Wednesday morning before we had eaten our breakfast. Uncle Will sat down and took off his brogans and put them before the fire to dry. His home-knit white woolen socks steamed as he held his feet to the hot fire. Then he thought of something he needed, a nip to keep him from taking cold. He got up and reached for the heavy glass bottle which always sat on the mantel and tilted it to take a swallow. I leaned over in my little chair, picked up the button hook, and got busy buttoning my shoes. But I looked out of the corner of my eye to see if he made a face when he swallowed a mouthful. A few days before this, Aunt Mary, my father's sister, had made us a visit and had told my mother of a new liver medicine that had been praised highly by everyone who had taken it. Mother, not being very well, decided to try it. She got a large package of the medicine and mixed it with a pint of whiskey and left it on the mantel where it would be handy for her to take a small dose occasionally. This, of course, had been prepared according to Aunt Mary's formula in the brown bottle. The medicine was as bitter as quinine. Uncle Will was a meek little man, and moreover he was a man of few words. Without making any comment, he sat down and finished drying his socks. Father came in from the stable and made a few quiet remarks about the cold weather. He was a quiet man, too. He and Uncle Will, who was old enough to have been his father, often shared a companionable silence. Mother soon called us to breakfast. After Uncle Will had asked a blessing, we ate fried sausage, red gravy, hot biscuits, and New Orleans molasses. Coffee was added to this for the grown persons, and there was milk for the children. There was no cause for haste. Everyone had time to enjoy the bountiful, nourishing, well-cooked meal. Nobody was ever in a hurry in our community in those days. There was time to enjoy life to the fullest, to visit, to have company, and at all times to make those who entered one's home feel welcome, regardless of the hour. If it happened to be mealtime, another plate would be laid, another chair would be placed, and the visitor would take his seat at the well-appointed table, sharing whatever the hostess had to offer. Chapter 19. Uncle Will. Uncle Will had 3 sons and 5 daughters. His 2 oldest daughters moved away from Trigg County. Cousin Peachy and her husband John Mills went to Hopkins County to make their home, and Cousin Sarah and her husband Willie Martin went to Graves County to live. Occasionally Cousin Peachy and Cousin Sarah would come back to visit Uncle Will and their stepmother, Aunt Betty. When this happened, the whole Thomas family would know it. The floors would be swept a little cleaner than usual, and every woman would wear a clean dress in case they should come to make a short visit. On some occasions, the aunts and uncles would go to Uncle Will's to visit the cousins. Cousin Peachy had been a beauty and a belle in her girlhood, and could boast of having had 3 proposals in one day. They were both great favorites among their paternal aunts and uncles. At other times, Cousin Bud, whose name was really William Madison, would hitch a team of mules to the wagon and take his sisters and their stepmother to visit the relatives. Cousin Bud always had a nice horse and buggy, but the 4 of them could not ride in one buggy. If they happened to go by the schoolhouse at playtime, they would stop the team and look at the children. They could pick Lily and me out from the other girls because of our red hair. As Uncle Will was 22 years older than his only sister, Aunt Mary Armstrong, she and his 2 oldest daughters were girlhood friends. So they usually went by Uncle Jim's and Uncle Fane's and on to see Aunt Mary a little while. After tobacco was cut and hung in the barn, it was the custom among the Thomas clan to sow the few acres in wheat to make enough flour to last a year. The wheat was sown and harvested by hand. In June, after Uncle Will had passed his 75th birthday, he helped Cousin Bud cut, tie, and shock the wheat using an old-fashioned hand cradle. He got too hot and tired and took pneumonia. He lived only a few days. On the Sunday afternoon of Uncle Will's funeral, which was held at the Starkey Thomas graveyard near our home, my mother's niece, Alice Crude, and I were appointed by Mother to receive the guests who came to our house before the hour which had been set for the last rites. Every time a buggy, jersey, or wagon would drive up to the front gate, we would go out and invite the women to come in. The men went on to the graveyard. A wagon drove up from Donaldson Creek, seated on 2 straight split-bottom chairs just behind the driver's seat were Cousin Etna and Cousin Josephine Thomas, who were usually called Et and Josie. Cousin Josie was a tall, thin, wiry person. She had no difficulty in getting off the wagon. But with Cousin Et it was quite different. She was short and thick. According to custom, the driver did not get down and assist the women to alight. He held the reins and got the mules to turn the front wheels far enough to one side to make the hound stick out. After this was done, Cousin Et put her left leg over the wagon bed, holding on to the wagon while she put her foot down on the hound. With proper maneuvering, she managed to put her right leg over the bed and down to the ground. If a woman let go her firm hold on the wagon bed, she was sure to fall. We accompanied Cousin Et and Cousin Josie into the house, where they met Mother and all the other women, blood kin, and in-laws. Shortly after this, all the women and girls put on their neatly ruffled, beautifully quilted, stiffly starched, handmade Sunday sunbonnets and set out on foot for the graveyard. The girls' bonnets were made of either pink or blue chambray. The middle-aged women wore gray bonnets, and a few elderly women who had lost their husbands wore long-tailed bonnets made of solid black percale. As soon as we reached the graveyard, we caught sight of the little black fringed horse-drawn hearse, which was bearing Uncle Will in his walnut coffin over the narrow dirt road where he had walked countless times from his home back to the place where he was born and had spent his boyhood years. We went inside the graveyard and waited for the procession to arrive. A silence fell and was not broken as we waited for the pallbearers with the coffin and the family to come inside the iron fence. Uncle Will's large family from Nebo, from Gracie, from Mayfield, and from the immediate vicinity came along behind the hearse and got out of their buggies and carriages. When this happened, every woman, young and old, was struck almost speechless with amazement. The daughters and granddaughters had their hats on, every last one of them except Cousin Jenny, the youngest daughter, who lived at Maple Grove. Nothing like that had ever happened before at a funeral at our graveyard, or at Maple Grove, or at Donaldson Creek. Even Cousin Forrest Vinson, who had always lived in our neighborhood and attended our church, had followed her aunts and cousins in wearing her best rose-trimmed Leghorn hat to her grandfather's funeral and burial. An age-old and time-honored custom had been broken, never to be fully brought back again. After the burying was over, Cousin Et and Cousin Josie went back to their home on Donaldson and told the Thomases there how much style had been put on at their Cousin Will's funeral. And for several days this was the main topic of conversation when women got together in these three neighborhoods. But Uncle Will, meek and lowly, wholly devoid of style, truly a good man, slept on in his peaceful grave, undisturbed by the comments his death had caused in these three communities. Chapter 20. Aunt Emily. Aunt Emily was an interesting person. She was not molded in a groove. She had individuality. She went where she pleased, said what she thought, and did what she wanted to do. No one ever set a pattern for her. I don't think Aunt Emily ever noticed a beautiful sunrise or a brilliant sunset. I don't believe she ever saw the beauty of the trees in the spring or their gorgeous colors in the autumn. I doubt that she ever heard the birds' joyful songs in spring, or noticed their gay plumage as she rode along the narrow lanes and through the open woods. Her thoughts were always centered on people. Aunt Emily never talked about her own domestic affairs. The things that filled other farm women's minds, such as house cleaning, sewing, quilting, canning, preserving, gardening, chickens, and so forth, never had a place in her conversation. She reared 4 sons and 6 daughters. As the daughters grew up, they took over a large share of the housework. When one of the girls married and went away to make her own home, the next in age would take over the management of the house when Aunt Emily was away from home. After all the girls were married and gone, Uncle Stan looked after the chickens. It would annoy Aunt Emily when they had visitors in the spring, and Uncle Stan would ask the women how many little chickens they had taken off, or how many hens they had sitting. Then, of course, he would tell them the exact number of chickens he had put off and the number of hens he had set. Aunt Emily didn't always see eye to eye with Mr. Thomas, as she called Uncle Stan, nor with the rest of the Thomas family, as for that matter. She didn't like Brother Will, as she always called Uncle Stan's oldest brother, any too well. She said they never had a fuss in the family but what he dropped in at that exact time. Uncle Will never meddled with anybody's business but his own, but he was the one person in the whole Thomas family who ever dared to say anything to Aunt Emily, even in a joke, that he knew she wouldn't like. Uncle Stan was building a 2-story frame house. The carpenters had to have their meals. The grown daughters were able to take care of that, so Aunt Emily went visiting every day for 3 weeks. One morning she rode by Uncle Will's place for the 4th day in succession. 3 dogs, all mongrels with foxhound blood predominating, were trotting along in front of her. Uncle Will was working by the roadside in his tobacco. Aunt Emily reined her horse in from its steady pace to a walk and spoke to him. "Well, Emily, which way are you making your drive today?" he asked, referring, of course, to fox hunting. Aunt Emily resented this, and she never forgot it. At the moment, she was on the way to the Maple Grove neighborhood to spend the day in a home where there was sickness. Aunt Emily knew how everybody lived. Nearly every family had plenty of pork and hominy, black-eyed peas and molasses, cornbread and biscuits. She knew how all the women managed their household affairs. She knew which women kept their soap grease made up. She knew who was extravagant with lard. She knew whether they used the meat wastefully. The Thomases always cut out the fryings from shoulders and hams, and then boil the hocks and joints with vegetables, which gave them a flavor that nothing else can give them. Aunt Emily knew one family that never used the hocks, ham joints, and shoulder blades. There were scores of such skeletons hanging in their meat house that had furnished food for skippers. Aunt Emily had a sour tongue when she was disappointed about anything. I used to go there with one of her granddaughters at the noon hour from school. When we were ready to leave, I would always invite her to visit us. That was the fashion in our neighborhood. A person who failed to do that was thought to be very rude. If Mother had returned Aunt Emily's last visit, she would be very polite and send her a special invitation to come to see her. But if Mother had not been there for some time, I would tremble in my shoes when I said goodbye. She would say, "Tell your mother to come if she wants to. If she doesn't want to come, tell her to stay at home." One morning, Sam, a colored man who worked at Uncle Stan's, came to our house. Mother asked about Aunt Emily's health. "Oh," he said, "Miss Emily's like a barn of tobacco. Sometimes she's in order and sometimes she ain't." Aunt Emily could sing. She had a wonderful voice. She was often called on to sing at funerals. And sometimes when she was sitting in a room with others, she would just push her spectacles up on top of her head, they were tied together with a string, and sing, "Children of the Heavenly King, as we journey sweetly sing," and other old hymns. Her children could sing. Some of her grandchildren and even her great-grandchildren had the same talent. Aunt Emily saw hundreds of children come into the world and put their first garments on them. She ministered to hundreds of people who were sick. She stood by scores of persons when Father Time was hovering near, ready to clip the brittle thread of life, and help prepare them for burial. Aunt Emily grew old and feeble. She took to her bed. She painted no more word pictures of people. She buried all their foibles and weaknesses in her heart. One day, in imagination, Aunt Emily got up from her sick bed. She crossed the road and went to the stable. Her old horse was waiting with his head over the gate. She got out her old side saddle that was still hanging in the gear room and put it on the horse, led the horse to the old block, got on him, and rode in dreams down the lane. Then she rode far away to the land of the blue, to that country from which no traveler ever returns. If in that heavenly land our stars are placed according to the good deeds we have done for others, while here in this life, surely Aunt Emily's crown must be full and as shining as the sun. Chapter 21. Christmas Morning. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Our stockings, which we had hung up the night before, were bulging with good things to eat. There was a usual assortment of candies, nuts, and fruits, and there were some toys, and also some useful gifts. There was plenty of food in the house, but there were no pies and cakes. It took these delicacies to make our Christmas perfect. One could not buy cakes and pies then, as there were no bakeries in those days. Our mother was sick in bed and had been for several weeks. After breakfast, I went out on the porch to watch the cardinals in the large cedar tree near the house. The scarlet plumage of the birds against the dark green cedar made the most beautiful Christmas decoration I have ever seen. I heard one of my father's brothers singing Amazing Grace as he came down the lane. There was nothing unusual about his singing a sacred song, for he was a religious man. There was nothing strange about his coming at that early hour, for it was the rule, and not the exception, for us to have visitors at all hours of the day. He carried a basket on his arm. My attention was drawn away from the birds. I followed Uncle Perry into the house and watched with wide eyes as he unloaded the basket. There were 2 large yellow pies. I can't say what variety they were now. Next came a layered cake with delicious icing. I cannot adequately express the happiness that kindness brought to me. It changed the day for all of us. The toil-worn hands that brought the basket are folded and gone now. Each Christmas day my thoughts turned to him and to his dear daughter, Cousin Dora, who baked those delicacies for us so long ago. Chapter 22. Our New Home. When my father's 7 brothers and 1 sister were married, Each was given a share of the original tract on which they built their homes. Each one built his house on the same ground floor plan, the only difference being in height. 3 built a 1-story house, 2 built houses that were 1.5 story, and 3 built 2-story houses. When I was 14, my father built a 2-story house using the same floor plan. All of these houses had 2 large rooms and a hall in front, with 2 equally large rooms running back, giving the house an L shape. Usually there were some long open porches running down by the back rooms, with a large pantry built on the end of the porch opening into the kitchen. We had a front porch with a banister. In these houses there were 2 staircases, one in the hall which led to the boys' room, or in our case it was called the guest room, over the parlor, and one in the family room which led to the girls' bedroom overhead. There was a brick chimney built outside at each end of the front part of the house, and one with a double fireplace which was called a stack chimney between the 2 back rooms which were the dining room and kitchen. There was no way to heat the bedrooms upstairs. This did not matter. The feather beds were large and fat and warm. There was plenty of cover, and young people wore a great deal more clothing then than now. Moreover, they didn't take off everything when they went to bed at night. 2 outer layers were considered enough to shed. A girl could take off her dress, long-sleeve corset cover, which was made of heavyweight bleached muslin, and petticoat of colored sateen or taffeta, and still have on a balmoral, a woolen skirt which was pleated to a waistband, a long-sleeve high-neck knit undershirt, and knee-length drawers of heavy bleached muslin. Of course, there were bleached ones, which were starched around the hems with tucks and Hamburg edge for Sunday. The home-knit woolen stockings which we wore in childhood, and the heavy cotton ones which later took their place, could be taken off and put on in much less time than the sheer silk and nylon stockings which are worn today. We 3 older girls each had a special task to do each morning. Lily made up the feather beds that were used by the family. She had to take off the sheets and cover, and beat up the feather bed and then put the cover back. She also kept the front part of the house swept, which included the parlor, family room, hall, and front porch on the first floor, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. When Lily was 14, she took over the sewing for Mother and the 4 girls. Before that, one of Father's nieces had done our sewing. This required a great deal of cutting, basting, and machine stitching on dresses, corset covers, drawers, and tucked and ruffled petticoats edged with either Swiss or Hamburg trimming. Petticoats were made of white cambric or domestic for summer, and black sateen for winter. Nothing could be bought ready-made except long-sleeve vests for winter, and balmorals, either red or blue. The only sewing required to finish a balmoral was to add a waistband. I had to wash and dry the breakfast dishes and sweep the dining room and kitchen. Mary swept the 2 long side porches, drew up some buckets of water from the cistern near the porch with the pulley, and brought them into the kitchen for use in preparing and cooking the noonday meal. When these tasks were done, we were free to go where we pleased and do what we liked until it was time for me to go to the wood pile and get some splinters and start the fire in the home comfort range, so Mother could put some meat on, usually a ham hock or a shoulder blade, in a black iron kettle to boil for dinner. When the meat was nearly done, she would add the vegetables, often cabbage or green beans, with potatoes cooking in another kettle. When it was time to finish dinner, I had to cook the plain cornbread on a baker on top of the range and set the table. In summer, Mary, Lena, and I often went out into the nearby fields and woods to enjoy the wildflowers and birds. One morning, after our tasks were done, we went across the field in front of the house. There was a wet weather spring there, and it was June. Only a slight trickle of water was flowing from it, which emptied into a small, shallow pool where the water was as clear as crystal. We went by the pools to see if the tadpoles had shed their tails and to watch them swim. As we were returning home, we found a chipping sparrow's nest with 4 bluish-green eggs speckled with blackish-brown in it. And as we came in the side yard gate, we found a wild rose bush in full bloom. When we went into the house, a blind woman was there. Her 10-year-old daughter was with her and was leading her from her home to the home of a married daughter 6 miles away. We had never seen them before, nor did we ever see them again. They had stopped to rest and eat dinner with us. After the blind woman and her daughter left, other guests came to spend the afternoon, and I forgot about the wild rose until I'd gone to bed. When I woke the next morning, I went to see it at once. It was not there. I looked over the fence, and there it was, standing on its head in the orchard. Its roots were dry, and the blooms were withered. I did not know who had put it there. Certainly not my mother, with all the meals she had to prepare. She seldom, if ever, went to that corner of the yard. It had to be my father or Lily. And since Father came in with the hired man at noon, ate his dinner, and went back to the field and worked until sundown, I couldn't see when he could have pulled up the bush. And anyway, with his knowledge of transplanting things, he would have known that it would die in a very short time. While Mary and I loved wildflowers, Lily loved cultivated flowers. Down the center of the vegetable garden, she had a walk with a border of flowers on each side. At a certain time each year, she would gather up the discarded tin buckets and dish pans and have us go with her to the wood pile and rake off the fresh chips. We would then fill the buckets and pans with the rich black chip dirt and spread it on the flower borders. We thought her flowers were very beautiful, and we did not mind helping her mulch and weed them. But we enjoyed far more the flowers that God could make without the help of human hands. 23. Strangers in the house. They came from river towns, usually Paducah and Nashville. If the buyers planned to look at timber in the extreme southern part of the county, they would come by boat to Linton, hire a horse and buggy, and drive from one prospective tract of timber to another. If they planned to ride over the central part of the county, they would leave the boat at Canton, and these were the ones who came to our house. Sometimes in late winter, a couple of tobacco buyers would ride in on their saddle horses at dusk and ask to spend the night. They rode from farm to farm, or you might say from barn to barn. They wanted to stay in the neighborhood as they were several miles from home. All these men got their supper, breakfast, and bed. They got their horses fed twice. It was all as free as the air they breathed. No one ever charged a person for a meal or a bed. My task was to set the table and wash the dishes. When there were extra persons in the house, it made extra work for me. Breakfast, they thanked Mother for the hospitality. Now and then, one of them would give me a smile, or a wink, or comment on my auburn curls. That was all I ever got out of it. Please remove this tape and insert 3A. It was not that way with the peddler. He always gave us something for his lodging. Sometimes a peddler would come walking down the dusty lane with his pack strapped on his back toward the close of a summer day and ask to spend the night. The next morning, after the peddler had eaten breakfast, he would open his pack. He had beautiful laces and linens. There were towels, pillow shams, handkerchiefs, tablecloths, napkins, lace, and insertion. It was a golden moment for a young girl who lived far back in the country. Mother always bought something from the peddler. I used to think she could not resist persons who were selling small wares, but now I think that she did not even try to resist them, that if $1 would help any man along his way, it was all right with her. One morning the peddler gave Mother a pair of lace pillow shams. There was a large peafowl in the center of the shams. Everybody in the Thomas family had large square pillows that sat upon the bolster. They made cases for them with ruffles all the way around them. Sometimes they put lace on the edge of the ruffles. Often they used hem stitching, hairpin trimming, drawn work, or tatting. Mother thought she had no use for the shams, so she gave them to Lily and me. The women in other neighborhoods used beautiful handmade shams on their pillows. Our earliest impressions last the longest, it seems. I had the impression that peddlers who walked over the country carrying their packs on their backs were the finest strangers who ever spent the night with us, and I often wished that I could have as great a thrill as I had when the peddler unfolded his magic pack. Chapter 24. Another Stranger in the House. My father never turned any man away who asked to spend the night. I don't remember that we ever had but one man in the house of whom we were afraid. He came up to the back of our house and around to the front door one winter evening at dusk and asked to spend the night. Father had gone away for the day and had not come in. Unasked, the man walked into our sitting room and took a seat to await Father's return. We lived off the public road. Very few persons ever passed by our house after sunset, but we soon saw two brothers coming down the lane on their way to visit their grandfather, who lived a half-mile beyond our place. I went out and asked them to come in and stay with us until our father came home. They were in their very early teens, but we felt much safer with them there. When Father came in, he readily agreed to keep the man. We had supper, and then made his bed in the guest room over the parlor. Mother, fearing that he might use the shotgun on us, took it from the closet under the staircase in the hall and put it in her bedroom. She locked the doors that led from the front hall into the parlor, the back porch, and the family room. She took the key from the front door, which was always locked at night, and hung it on a nail in her room. We thought the stranger might have a partner and let him in that way after we had gone to bed. We had kerosene lamps and the hall was dark at night. None of us slept very much that night, except Father. The next morning Father got up at sunrise, made the fires as usual, and then went to the stable to help feed the stock. When he came back to the house, he unlocked the doors, went up the steps to the landing, and called the stranger. The man came down and ate a hearty breakfast. After that he seated himself before the fire in the family room with Father and took off his shoes. He asked for fresh rags to wrap his feet, which were blistered from walking on frozen ground. While he was wrapping his feet, he made his only comment in a German accent. "You had a war here once between the states." He left without telling us his name or where he was going. We only knew that he was fleeing from something. To this day, I wonder where our father kept his gold that night. Probably in the usual place, a box he had built underneath the middle step of the hall stairway. Nobody would have looked for money hidden there. Chapter 25. A Distinguished Guest. One of Mother's cousins had returned to his native state and was visiting the scenes of his boyhood. He had gone away a tall, awkward country lad, and had come back a middle-aged circuit judge. He had won his laurels in Texas. He and his brother, Cousin Jim Patterson, had planned to attend preaching at Oak Grove, the church a mile from our house, and have dinner with us. Mother was eager to put her best foot forward, as we were having big company. The best linen tablecloth and napkins were brought out. The yellow-bordered, white napkins, stiffly starched and folded three-cornered, were placed in the best goblets with the white fringe standing up. The dining room had no screens. In fact, no one in our neighborhood, or in the entire county, had his doors and windows screened at that time. The door that opened on the porch stood open in summer to keep the room cool. A few days before, an old hen had made up her mind to come into the dining room each morning and lay an egg on top of the chest of drawers. No one ever knew when she came in, but after she had laid an egg, she would announce it with loud cackles as she flew out the door and ran across the porch. Mother was determined to keep the hen out of the room that day. We kept the doors shut and the windows down all morning. But the hen was just as determined to get in. Every time the door was open for someone to pass through, she had to be driven away. The preacher was long-winded that morning, and after the sermon was over, everyone who had ever known Judge John Patterson had to shake hands with him and introduce his wife and children. It was rather late when the gray mule, which was hitched to a no-top or stick-back buggy, came jogging down the lane to our gate, stirring up a cloud of dust. Mother and Father greeted the guests cordially. After Cousin Jim and Father had taken the mule to the stable and watered and fed it, the men washed their hands at a shelf on the porch in front of the dining room, where brass-bound wooden buckets filled with water, tin washpans, and towels were kept for that purpose. We went into the dining room and sat down at the table. Before Cousin Jim had finished with the blessing, the old hen came in. A little perturbed because she had been kept waiting so long, she was cackling in a nervous sort of way. Mother nudged me under the table to shoo old Dominic out of the room. I drove her out 3 times. Then Mother gave me a sign to leave her alone. Before we got to the dessert, Mother started talking a little louder and faster so no one would hear the egg drop. We drew a breath of relief when the old hen went cackling out through the door and back toward the chicken yard. It was an embarrassing moment for me, but Mother, in her usual nonchalant way, let it pass without mention, or even dampening her gay spirits. She and the cousins went on picking up the threads of their happy childhood. We settled down to enjoy the good cake Mother had baked for the occasion. There were 2 kinds, white and yellow, which were served with fresh blackberries, which Father had gathered near the house early that morning. Chapter 26. A Burial at the Graveyard. Nearly every one of the early settlers in our section of the county started a graveyard on his land. My grandfather started a burying ground on the slope near the house when he lost a daughter who was 7 years old. A large number of his descendants were later buried there. In my childhood, when there was a death in the family, the grave diggers would come early and get the spades, picks, and shovels and start the grave. They were members of families that lived in the neighborhood, and the most of them were kin to us. My mother used to say that she did not have time for any grief when there was a death in our family. She had to prepare a large quantity of food when a person was buried at the graveyard. Father would invite all the men who were there at noon to come down to the house and have dinner with us. All of them would come, except the ones who had to go home and bring their families to the funeral. Some women who lived out of the neighborhood would come in the morning and bring their children. They, too, and the men in their families, would eat dinner with us. The guests would eat in shifts, so to speak, a table full at a time. That was the custom, and even if Mother had preferred to have them all eat at one time, she never would have known how many plates to set till the last minute. Before we had had time to eat our dinner or wash the dishes and put them away, other women would begin to come in for the funeral, even though it was not to be held for 2 hours or more at the graveyard. In summer, the women would take off their Sunday sunbonnets and put them on a bed in Mother's bedroom, which was also used as a sitting room. In winter, the women would take off their cloaks or capes as well as their bonnets. The women kept coming in till the room was full. We brought in extra chairs for the older women and placed them near the fireplace. Aunt Mary Perry had tizzy. No one ever said asthma in those days. She sat near the fire and wheezed for breath. The half-mile ride on the wagon in cold air had made her breathing worse. Everyone was quiet. The women had nice manners. They never talked much when there was a death in the family, anyway. When the funeral procession was ready to leave the dead person's house, someone would ride off first and come to the graveyard. Then our father would come down to the house and let us know it was time for us to go. The women would move about quickly as they all tried to put on their bonnets and wraps at one time. Not a one of them ever smoothed her hair or looked at herself in the mirror that was hung above the walnut bureau. No one had a handbag or comb or any cosmetics with her. Just a bonnet and wrap was all she had to pick up. Father would look after the fire and fasten the doors after the women had started to the graveyard, with the younger ones leading the way and the older ones walking very slowly. Chapter 27. The Protracted Meeting. Each autumn a protracted meeting was held at the church in October. The men set this time to have the meeting because they had some leisure then. By that time the small patches of hay had been cut and stacked, that is, what was left after the loss had been filled. The tobacco had been cut, hung in the barns, and fired. The small patches of ground where tobacco had been grown had been sown in wheat after it had been soaked in a bluestone solution to keep it from having smut. It was not time to harvest the corn. No one stored corn at that time until there had been several heavy frosts. When the time came to hold the meeting, every man made it a point to attend the 11 o'clock morning services as well as those which were held in the evening. While the meeting was going on, we had to wear better dresses to school than usual. School would be dismissed at 10:30, and the entire group would go to church. We would be lined up according to height. 2 of the tallest boys would lead one line, and 2 of the largest girls the other. The church was a quarter of a mile from the schoolhouse. The road went through woods. Roots and deep ruts made it pretty hard for the girls as they tried to keep up with the boys and also keep their shoes clean. The middle row was always left for the school. Each pupil had to keep quiet through the entire service, which lasted 1 hour. As a rule, the visiting minister would preach to the members the first week. The first day he would use for his text, "Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting," or some other passage along that line. And he would lay it on the members heavily as he tried to make them do their duty. The next morning, perhaps he would use David's plea, "Restore unto me the joys of thy salvation," and do his best to get the backsliders in a better spiritual condition. The third morning, he was likely to take his text from one of Paul's epistles, such as, "Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." At the close of this sermon, the preacher would feel that the members had been sufficiently revived to get off their seats and come to the altar. He would invite every Christian who was willing to obey Paul's admonition to come forward and shake hands with the preachers and with one another. The men would take the lead, the oldest and more pious going first, and then the women would go. Sometimes this would cause some embarrassment. If 2 of the men or women were not on good terms, they would have to maneuver considerably or watch the corners to avoid meeting each other face to face. But this situation did not come up very often. As a rule, all the members were on good speaking terms. The second week was spent trying to reach the unsaved in the community. Preachers did not pussyfoot over hell in those days. They spiked their boots with hobnails and stomped all over it. They made it sound real. They made heaven, with all its beauty and promise, a far more desirable place to go. Often the mourner's bench was crowded with boys and girls who had reached the age of accountability. Their fathers, mothers, and older sisters would stand at the altar while the preachers and others instructed them as how to find the light. Sometimes they went up several times before they were satisfied, their tear-stained faces showing the depth of their contrition. The meeting would close on Friday night of the second week, and the baptizing would take place Saturday morning. While the meeting was on hand, we barely had time to eat lunch before the bell would ring and classes began. But the following Monday we would be back on schedule. We would have an hour for lunch and play at noon. We would go down through the open woods to a place where the ground was low and begin a big meeting, as the old-timers still called it. All children are imitators, and we were no exception. A few of the girls who were fluent in speech and given to mimicry did the preaching. Others who could carry a tune and had memorized a few hymns took charge of the singing. Since I could neither carry a tune nor was glib of tongue, I had to be one of the half-dozen mourners. This made it hard on me, as we were not allowed to come through for several days. The mourner's bench was a large 10-foot log that someone had sawed off for fence rails and had never used. Its thick, deeply furrowed bark made a rough seat. I had to sit with my face buried in the girl's shoulders in front of me. The others did the same. At that time, all dresses were fastened down the back. We knew a woman of whom it was whispered that while she was talking to mourners, she would take out a pin now and then from the girls' dresses while she had her hand on their backs. By doing this, she kept up her stock of pins. Mother always put buttons on our dresses, but some of the girls would have to go to the house with their backs flapping when the bell rang. It was hard to find pins in the dead leaves. One day when we were at the mourner's bench, a long black snake, a racer, disturbed by the commotion, came out from under the log and glided swiftly away into a pile of dead leaves. This broke up the meeting. We feared another snake might be under the log, its mate, of course. We had been piling leaves at recess for several days to make a place for the baptizing. The next day at noon we joined the church. but refused to be dipped until the entire pile of leaves had been turned. Chapter 28. The Baptizing. The protracted meeting closed at the little white church. Lily and I, along with 6 other girls and a boy, joined the church. We were to be baptized in Donaldson Creek at the place where the Cadiz and Dover Road crosses the stream. Donaldson, with its clear blue water, was the most beautiful stream in the county. It was nearly always chosen for the baptismal site. We lived 3 miles from Donaldson. The road went through the fields for a mile and then came out on the Dover Road. The main road was just wide enough for a wagon to travel on. It went through woods. The trees and underbrush grew so close to the ground that in many places it was impossible for vehicles going in opposite directions to pass each other. When 2 drivers met, one of them had to find a suitable place, pull out of the road, and wait for the other one to pass. This did not cause any inconvenience. A man, even when he had his family with him, would always stop when he met another man. They would pass the time of day, make small comments on the weather, and swap the latest neighborhood news. No one ever got in a hurry. Every man had time to be courteous to everyone he met. Sometimes young men with new buggies and fast trotters would race with each other on the turnpike on Sunday afternoon. Boys who rode horseback would sometimes pass wagons and make families eat their horses' dust. But if there were girls in the wagon, the boys would ride along behind it. They would keep their horses' heads just far enough back to keep them from getting more than a nibble of hay now and then from the back of the wagon. From time to time, the girls would favor them with a smile and tender glance. These, of course, were boys who were too young to have buggies, and the girls were too young, according to their parents' way of thinking, to ride in buggies with young men. When the morning came for the baptizing, Mother got off later than she had planned. She had to collect and pack the clothes we were going to put on after we were baptized. Father drove as fast as the lazy mules could be persuaded to go. We crossed the fields and turned out on the public road. Our Jersey was the last vehicle in the long procession. This embarrassed our father because he was always ahead of time at all church or other religious meetings. Cousin Selden Thomas was just ahead of us with his family in a wagon, and just in front of him were 2 narrow, shiny new buggies, each drawn by a bay horse as slick as a satin ribbon. These horses were fast trotters. They could hold their own in any race on the turnpike on Sunday, but for some reason the drivers were holding them back to a snail's gait. Perhaps owners wanted everybody else to get there first so they could make a bigger splurge when they drove up with their girls. John and Bill Heath both liked to make a show. My mind was mostly filled with the immersion I was going to receive, but I noticed the dresses that Dora and Molly Thomas were wearing. The sleeves were mutton ham and extended, on the left arm of course, far out beyond the narrow backs of the buggies. The dresses were made of lustrous sateen. Dora's was bright blue with white ostrich plumes splashed over it. Molly's was a golden brown with the same figure. Cousin Selden was eager to go on. With his usual banter, he called back to Father. He said it was unfortunate that we had to get in behind the courting couples, that if the young men hadn't spent so much time blacking their mustaches and brushing their horses, they would have been out of folks' way who had the morning chores to do before they could leave home. The road spread out before it got to the creek. The shiny horses swept up with a flourish. They stirred up a lot of dust, and it blew back on us. The other girls were already pinned and waiting. They didn't dare to stoop or turn. Mother and some other women went to work on us at once. She took a paper of straight pins from her satchel and fastened my skirt and 3 underskirts together. She pinned all the skirts securely to my knee-length drawers. This was to keep my skirts from floating on the water and showing my legs when I waded in. Lily's clothes were fastened together in the same way. Soon all 9 of us took hold of each other's hands and waded in. The pastor had already sounded the depth of the water and left the stick standing where he intended to dip us. While we were going in to be baptized, the church members sang, "There is a fountain filled with blood." And they were singing Amazing Grace when we came out of the water. They met us when we reached the bank and gave us the hand of church fellowship. The women led all the girls up into the woods a short distance and soon had us in dry clothing again. Chapter 29, Church Rules. The second Sunday in each month and the preceding Saturday were the regular preaching dates at the little white church. The pastor, Reverend A.C. Doris, would drive down in his buggy from Lafayette on Saturday morning and preach at 11 o'clock. After the preaching service, there would be a business meeting. Occasionally, some of the younger members would go to a square dance and take part in it. If this leaked out, it was brought before the church at the next regular business meeting, as dancing was a violation of one of the rules of the church. A committee made up of 3 of the older brethren would be appointed to visit the offending members. If they said they were sorry, and their fathers usually made them say they were, everything worked out well, and no more was said about it. But now and then one of the boys, who was more sincere than some of the others, or perhaps not quite so much under the parental thumb, would refuse to make such an acknowledgment. This would cause a lot of comment, and more members would attend the next Saturday meeting than was usual, just to see what would be done about it. Having given the young offending brother this alternative, there was nothing left for the serious-minded, stern-faced deacons and laymen to do but turn him out of the church, thereby setting an example for the rest of the youngsters. Often the young members were a bit confused about this. We could have a play party and dance folk games until midnight to music on the harpsichord or French harp, and no one ever mentioned it in the church. We all knew the fiddle, the banjo, and the guitar were forbidden. None of the Thomas family ever had a play party except my parents, and then Cousin Bud and Cousin Johnny Thomas had to come over that night and entertain Father while the folk games were being played. But there were other members of the church, mostly young married couples, who did not mind our having a party now and then in winter in their homes. Once Lily and I attended a party in another neighborhood, when the fiddle squeaked and the banjo strummed, and we gaily moved our feet to the rhythm and enjoyed it to the last step. It was lucky for us that this did not reach the deacon's ears. Chapter 30. The Ghost of Deepwood. In the large tract of woods south of our house there was a graveyard that had been there for many years. It was a lonesome place at any time. The oaks were tall and close together, and there was a thick undergrowth of dogwood. In summer the shadows were so deep and dark one could not see clearly except for a few yards. It was even worse in autumn when there was a haze over the woods. There was always a feeling that someone was there, hiding close by behind one of the trees. In winter, when the trees were bare and their branches stirred and rattled and creaked in the chilling blast, one could hear voices and footsteps close by, then far away, then dying out altogether. After a few seconds, the same sounds would be repeated. The last family that had been buried in the graveyard and had lived in an old one-room log house with a side room or lean-to which was still standing in the small field beyond the southern edge of the woods. The head of that house had annoyed my grandfather and my father for many years with his small thefts. One Sunday morning when my father was walking over the farm, he went to the Allen place. No one lived in the house. It was dilapidated, but there were some nice apple trees in the orchard that the former owner had planted. Father found a bushel of apples in a sack under one of the trees. About that time he saw Mr. Blank, farther down in the orchard, walking away as fast as he could. "Who left these apples here?" my father asked. "I don't know. They were here when I came," answered Mr. Blank. With his usual calm manner, Father said, "Well, this is a good sack. I believe I'll take it home with me." He poured the apples on the ground, put the sack over his shoulder, and started toward home. One cold morning in the dead of winter, my father went to the stable to feed the stock. As he went through the front lot gate, he saw Mr. Blank standing by one of the corn cribs. The cribs were near the road and across the lot from the stable. Like the stable, they were built of logs and covered with clapboards. There was an open hall or driveway between the cribs, and both cribs opened to the hall. At harvest time, the best ears were put into one crib, and the nubbins and shucks into the other. The crib doors were small, about 4 feet long and 3 feet wide, and were hung without hinges. Father unlocked the crib, which held the best corn, stepped over the logs and through the door, picked up 2 baskets of corn, and went across the lot to feed the stock. He replaced the baskets and snapped the padlock. When he started back to the house to eat his breakfast, Mr. Blank was still standing by the crib. As Father went through the gate, he gave Mr. Blank a cordial invitation to go down with him and have breakfast, but Mr. Blank refused the invitation. Father ate breakfast, milked 2 cows, and went back to the stable. He turned the stock out to get water, Then he went to the crib, unlocked the door, unfastened the steel trap, and let Mr. Blank take his hand, which was rather numb, out of the crack between the locks. Mr. Blank did not pick up the half-filled sack at his feet. He left in great haste and without any of his usual pleasantness. Father went to the stable one morning, and his best horse was gone. He went to see a woman who could tell fortunes. She told him he was looking for a four-footed animal, that he would find it hitched to a plow near a large stream. She told him how to reach the place. My father and Uncle Alfred, one of his older brothers, got on their horses, took their guns, and rode off in search of the horse. They crossed the state line. A few miles from Clarksville, Tennessee, they found the horse and brought it home. The man who stole the horse and sold it lived in Tennessee. He was kin to Mr. Blank and had concluded a visit there when he took the horse back with him. In court, in our county seat, he was convicted and sentenced. He had consumption when he took the horse and died in prison. Mr. Blank was never implicated, but it was rumored that when he would step outside his house on a starless, windy night, he would see a dark horse standing behind the side room. A slender man would come swiftly out of the back kitchen door, get on the horse, wave his hand, and ride silently away in the darkness of the night. A friend of the family said when this happened, Mr. Blank would come back into the house shaking like a leaf. Like all mortals here below, Mr. Blank came to the end of his earthly journey. He was placed in a wooden coffin. Some of the men who could do carpentry made a box from rough planks. After the funeral, the coffin was placed in a farm wagon and drawn by 2 mules over the short way across the field and into the woods. Please turn to 3B. On the wagon, one of them looked across at the other and said, "If anybody around here misses anything tonight, they can't lay it on Blank." The darky said Mr. Blank's spirit never could rest in peace, that every night he would wander through the woods and over the nearby fields, that sometimes in broad daylight they would see him trudging along with a sack of apples or potatoes or corn on his back. As a rule, they never went that way at night, but one time 3 colored men got up enough courage to go coon hunting in Deepwood, some distance from the graveyard. They did not dare go near it. They saw the old man moving along with a good-sized shoat slung over his shoulder. Before the darkies could run away, a chestnut horse with a slender rider went sweeping by and trampled the old man down. The darkies forgot the coon they'd caught, the axe they had taken to chop down a tree if necessary, and the small jug of spirits they had taken to keep themselves warm. They took to their heels and made a vow as they ran that they never again, under any circumstances, would cross the creek after dark. Chapter 31. We go through Deepwood at night. It was Christmas. 2 of our cousins were spending a few days with Lily and me. We were all in our early teens and were just beginning to have a few dates. On 2 or 3 occasions when we had gone to parties, boys had asked our permission to walk home with us, leading their horses as we went along. This custom or arrangement had one advantage for a young fellow who was just starting out, so to speak. The boy, leading his horse by the reins, kept a space of several yards between him and his girlfriend and the couple that was behind them. And of course no one wanted to walk right at a horse's heels. If a boy happened to be bashful or was not sure he could get another date, he could ask the girl without the next couple hearing him. This custom had one disadvantage. In crossing over little streams or muddy places, the horse often splattered water and mud on the young courting couple. While we were all looking forward to sitting in the parlor that evening and having a small party with the 3 boys that were coming to see us, a young man rode up on his horse and invited us to a singing in the home of one of the deacons of the church, who nearly always led the singing while Lily or I played the organ. The deacon and his family lived about 3/4 of a mile beyond our place. To reach this house we had to go over a narrow, winding road through the deep wood. Lily and I had never been through these woods at night, but we had gone through them a number of times in the day with our parents to visit a family that lived 2 miles farther on. The boys came early. They tied their horses to the hitching rack, and we set out from home soon after dark. It was a dark night. Black clouds kept scuttling across the thin new moon. A hoot owl kept calling, "Hoo, hoo, who are you?" Somewhere in the woods, hounds had treed something, and had barked until their voices sounded hoarse and weird, as their baying fell on the wind-swept night. The tops of the mighty oaks swayed in the fitful gusts, and their branches beat up and down like so many arms and hands shaking a finger of warning to all who passed that way. We came close to the graveyard. All the graves had sunk to a level with the rest of the ground, and none of them had markers. One whole family had been buried in a row with their heads within a few feet of the road. Someone had riven heavy oaken boards about 3 feet long and made a separate cover or peaked roof over each grave. The head of the row, what if his ghost should be wandering over his old familiar haunt that night? We quickened our pace. Our teeth chattered, and it was not altogether from cold. Our eyes bulged as we tried to penetrate the darkness all about us. Just as we were getting near the graves and could see the crude shelters over them, one of the boys shouted, "Look out! Old man Blank will get you." Quicker than we could blink our eyes, strange, terrifying sounds rent the air. Dark forms rose up from the graves and passed quickly in front of us. Farther back from the road, where there were other graves, still more alarming sounds were heard. Dark, shadowy forms crossed the road behind us. We could not move forward. We could not turn back. We were hemmed in on all sides. We stood rooted to the spot, trembling, sick with terror. Finally, after what seemed hours, but must have been only a very few seconds, a big black sow with some white spots on her back ran right in among us and knocked one of the boys flat on his back. This hindered her, and with a snort, a loud grunt, and a squeal, she took off after the rest of her relatives, with several pigs trailing after her. These were our father's hogs, razorbacks, or ridge rooters as they were called. They wintered on acorns and made their beds of dead leaves and broom sedge far from the house. Occasionally, when there was a deep snow, they would come to the lot to be fed corn. Soon after our encounter with the hogs, we came to the open field where we could see the light from a kerosene lamp through a window of the deacon's house. It was a welcome sight. The old empty store-and-a-half log house with its sagging roof and dilapidated lean-to, which stood in the middle of the clearing, and just a few yards to the right of the road, loomed dark and forbidding as we approached it. Somewhere in the darkness the iron-shod hoofs of a horse could be heard as it galloped over a rocky slope of the muddy road. Although our spirits had become somewhat restored by the time we reached the deacon's house and were seated before the wood fire in the light room, our host must have thought we were a dull group of youngsters that evening. Not a tune did we play, not a hymn did we sing, and we didn't talk much either. We shared a deep silence as we thought of our narrow escape from meeting with ghosts on the way, and dreaded our return trip through the deep, dark woods that night. We left early. When we reached the graveyard, we made a detour and walked as softly as we could over the dead leaves. Chapter 32, A Moonlight. When I was in my teens, moonlights were a popular form of entertainment for young folk in summer. The name was misleading. If a young lady planned to have a moonlight, she never once thought of the moon. Whether it was in its first quarter or was full made no difference. One summer, 2 of our girlfriends decided to give a moonlight. They made a dozen lanterns using cardboard for the bottom and foolscap paper for the sides. A narrow strip of cardboard was sewn around the top of each lantern to hold its shape. After the candles had been set in the lanterns, a string was attached to the top of each one, and they were swung to the lower branches of trees, tall shrubs, and other convenient places in the front yard. 2 kerosene lanterns were hung on nails on the front porch to give additional light. The girls' brothers made the seats out of rough lumber. The planks, which were to be used later in repairing the outbuildings, were not sawed into shorter lengths. 3 couples had to sit on one seat. There were a few seats made of short planks, and some straight chairs from the dining room and kitchen were placed in the yard. When we arrived, we were invited into the family room and given a chance to smooth our hair and powder our face. A glass dish containing lumpy talcum powder and chamois skin was on the dresser for the guests to use as freely as they desired. After we had primped, we went across the wide hall and into the parlor and seated ourselves beside some other girls who were already there. When all invited guests had arrived, the 2 hostesses went out the front door where the young men were standing and asked them to come in and take the girls out into the yard. The boys hung back. No one wanted to be first. It took a great deal of persuasion to get the first young man to come in. All the while, some of the boys were looking through the open window to see who was there and decide which girls they would bring out. After some hesitation by the boys and a lot of persuasion by the hostesses, one of them entered the parlor on a young man's arm and introduced him to the girl he had chosen. The girl got up, took his arm, and accompanied him to the lawn, where they found a seat. A short one, of course, as they were always taken first. The hostesses went on in this way until all the girls were out of the parlor. There were some wallflowers, as was the case at every moonlight, who were left in the parlor after all the other girls were gone. They were a problem. As was usual, the hostess had a hard time getting them out. They had to rely on their best friends to help them and promised to release them as soon as was possible after the moonlight got started and partners could be exchanged. This situation made a splendid arrangement for the couples who got out first, as they had some time to talk without interruption before the men were compelled to give up their seats to rivals. It was an undisputed rule of etiquette for every man to give up his seat when another man was introduced to his companion. After all the girls were in the yard, the hostesses took young men who were then quite fluent of speech and willing to be chosen, since they could go where they pleased, and introduced them to girls they were eager to meet. A moonlight often caused some of the girls to become somewhat flustered. When I attended my first one and the older girls started going out of the parlor and I was the next to the last to go, I was beginning to feel pretty tense. The boys my age were too bashful to go into the house. On Sunday before my friends had the moonlight, in company with some other young people, I had visited some cousins at Lafayette. There I met a very handsome young man who made an engagement to meet me at the moonlight. Another man had taken me out to the lawn before he got there. 20 miles was a long way to go to an entertainment in horse and buggy days. The young man did not come to talk to me. I knew he was there because I had seen him coming out the front door with another girl. I had no date, as I had expected him to take me home. But as soon as the party was over, another boy whom I had never gone with before asked if he could take me home. As we walked to the gate together and got into his buggy, I saw the new friend I had the engagement with stop a few yards from us. A score of years later, the same man, who with his family was living in Florida, met a man from our county. He asked my cousin if he knew me, and then told him what had happened when he had had his only date with me. The hostess, knowing he was a stranger, took advantage of it, and got him to take the last girl out of the parlor. For 3 hours they sat together in the yard, neither of them saying anything. The girl did not offer to release him, and he was too chivalrous to walk off and leave her sitting there alone. He thought he would see me when the moonlight was over and take me home. But alas, the plans one made at a moonlight did not always work out. So what might have been a flowering romance was nipped in the bud. Chapter 33. The Turnpike. All the roads in the county were dirt roads except the turnpike, which was owned by a company. It extended from the Cumberland River at Canton to 2 miles east of Cadiz, a distance of 12 miles. This narrow road was drained, and the surface was made of gravel, which was taken from nearby creeks. The heavy rains in winter and spring deposited the gravel in beds. In summer and autumn, this gravel was dry. Each fall, the president of the Turnpike Company would hire farmers to haul gravel and repair the road. There were 3 toll gates on the pike, one near each end and another near the middle. They were not gates, but poles, which had been made from sapling. The pole was fastened to a 4-foot post, which was set across the road from the toll gate house. A weight was placed on the post. The smaller end of the pole was fastened to the gatekeeper's porch with a heavy chain. The keeper could let the gate up without getting in rain or snow. Often women attended to this. The gate was left up after midnight. There was not much traveling after that time in horse and buggy days. A certain price was paid for every vehicle that went under the gate. A heavily loaded wagon was charged 25 cents. A wagon with light load, 15 cents. A carriage with 2 horses, 15 cents. A buggy, 10 cents. A horseback rider paid 5 cents. Cattle were 5 cents a head, and sheep 3 cents. In good weather, some tight-fisted men, as they were called, would drive several miles out of their way to keep from paying toll at the middle gate. It was not so easy to avoid the other 2. A pedestrian did not pay any toll. Persons who were going to or from church went through toll-free, and of course preachers did not pay anything. A girl who was going to town to take music lessons went free, provided she was the organist at church. It's pleasant to remember the days I spent in my aunt's home on the Pike, which is now a part of United States Highway 68. When I was in my teens, about 200 of us used to gather there one day every Christmas. What feasts Aunt Clara would spread on the long table in the dining room. There was turkey with stuffing and rich gravy, ham baked to a tender crispness, salads, pickles, boiled custard, and cakes, which always included Prince of Wales. After nightfall, we always had a play party. The music would strike up, usually the harp played by one of the boys, and we who liked to trip the toe played the Virginia Reel, Skip to Maloo, The Girl I Left Behind Me, Rosie Bacalana, Chase a Buffalo, Old Joe Clark, and many others. Those who did not like to play sat in pairs in the parlor and said tender nothings to each other while we danced in the wide hall. Chapter 34, A Trip to Town. When I was young, we went to Katie's twice each year, in the spring and fall. For several days beforehand, at odd times, Mother would be busy with pencil and paper, figuring how much material it would take to make our dresses. She would make a list of all the things she planned to buy. Of course, the domestic, both bleached and unbleached, and Lousdale cambric that was to be used in making petticoats, camisoles, drawers, and gowns was bought by the bolt, or half bolt, 50 or 25 yards. Val lace and insertions to match were bought in packages of 10 yards. We had to pay some regard to the weather, as the jersey had no top. Later our father bought a carriage or a phaeton with fringe around the top. But when the day finally came for us to go, we ate breakfast, did the morning chores, dressed as quickly as we could, and set out for the county seat, which was 6 miles away. The 2 mules, one tall iron gray and one small pudgy bay, were ill-matched, lazy and slow. Father drove, and Lily, who always rode on the front seat, held the whip. She would flick the mules' rumps now and then when we came to a few yards of level ground to make them trot. Lena rode between Father and Lily. Mother and I occupied the back seat with Mary sandwiched in between. We took 2 large black cotton parasols to ward off whatever the weatherman had in store for us, perhaps a sudden spring shower or a hot sunshine in the afternoon. As we drove through the short business district of the county seat, Mr. Ed Street came out of the farmer's bank. He said, "Well, Starkey, you've got a carriage almost full." Mother had one of her spells of deafness at the time, and she said with some spirit, "My hair is not any whiter than yours." She was very sensitive about her hair turning a little gray while she was so young. Mr. Street looked a little surprised, but he made no further comment. Mother's favorite place to trade was Jefferson and Street, which was operated by Mr. Jefferson. When we would go into the store, Mr. Jefferson would invite Mother to have a seat on one of the stools, which were placed several feet apart beside the counter and fastened to the floor, and there she would sit until everything had been purchased except the millinery. The material for our dresses would be bought first. Calico was 5 cents a yard. Mother bought plenty. The scraps and anything that was not needed were used in piecing quilts. A swinging rack which held bolts of calico and gingham on all of its 4 sides was hung above the counter. The merchant or clerk would turn the rack, and we would look at the many patterns. If we liked a certain bolt, it was taken down and placed on the counter in front of Mother. From these, each one of us would choose a dress. Mother would look at her memorandum and give the number of yards required. The merchant would take a yardstick, measure the material, and cut off the desired length. He would then fold the material carefully with the wrong side out, take a pencil which was stuck behind his ear, put the price on it, and place it in a large basket which was kept under the counter for that purpose. Gingham was bought next. It was 10 cents a yard. The rack would go round again, and we would make another selection. Naturally, we had been looking at the gingham while the calico was under consideration. Next would come our best dresses. Several materials which were kept on shelves behind the counters would be brought out. White and colored dotted Swiss, organdy, muslin, and voile. Lily and I would either get our dresses alike or the same material in different colors. The trimmings for these dresses were carefully selected, also the mother of pearl buttons, which were placed close together down the back to the waist. After the material for our dresses had been placed in the basket, our eyes would roam over the store while Mother decided on the white goods, thread, buttons, hose, and elastic. But We would turn our attention to the counter again when the slippers were set before Mother, as we were allowed to help choose our own shoes. Nothing was said or thought, or even known perhaps, about having shoes the right width for growing feet. We bought our shoes only by number. If you wore a pair size 3, then the next pair would be bought a size or 2 larger. After the shoes had been bought, we would go to the millinery department, which was in the back of the store, and select our hats. I always had blue ribbon on my hat, as my hair was red. We chose our hats because they were pretty, and we liked them, regardless of how suitable they were to wear with our dresses. When the hats had been put into cardboard boxes and placed on the counter near the basket, the merchant would make out the bill. This took some time. In the spring, the bill did not run so high, as no one ever bought a cloak or a cape except in autumn or winter. Coat suits were not in style at that time. Mr. Jefferson would state the amount that was due. As a rule, Father would take the money from his pocket and pay it, but on one occasion I remember he told him he would pay him within a few days. He never went into his gold if it could be avoided. Women did not go to town very often. Sometimes we were the only persons in the store. After the merchandise had been bought, we would sit down on a long seat across the room from the counters and rest until Father was ready to start home. A bucket of water with a long-handled dipper was kept on a shelf in the back of the store for customers' use. The water was brought from a well across the street in front of the courthouse. There was a wooden trough near the well where farmers watered their stock. Wagons were parked on one side of the court square, and teams were hitched on the other side. One day, while we were waiting for Father to dry the jersey in front of the store so we could load our things and go home, Lily saw some jewelry. She insisted that Mother buy a ring for her. They were 50 cents apiece. Mr. Jefferson saw my wistful look, and he said, "Why not buy one for Maddie, too?" So Father bought us rings that were set with our birthstones. Lily's had a turquoise, and mine had a ruby. We never were happier than we were that day as we rode home. The sun glinted on our rings when we held our freckled hands out beyond the shade of the black cotton parasol. Everyone was glad that we were on our way home. Mother was tired from the stress of the day. Father was a little let down from so much spending, but nothing dampened our spirits. When we passed by Uncle Perry's house, the women folk came out and asked us what we had bought. Father said, "They've got over $50 packed under these 2 seats." They always came to our house the next day to see what we had bought, and when they went to town, we showed the same interest in their hats and dresses. Chapter 35. The Circus. Wonder of wonders, we were taking a special trip to town. We were going to a show. A small one-ring circus was coming to town. Father and Mother had promised to take us. Lucy, the girl on the next farm, was eager to go. Aunt Mary, her foster mother, wanted her to go, too. But Uncle Perry, who was a deacon in the church and superintendent of the Sunday school, would never have thought of being called at a circus, nor would any of the other older Thomases, as for that matter. I don't know just how Mother persuaded Father to go. The day before the circus, Mother decided we would go in the wagon so that we could take Aunt Mary and Lucy with us. We set out in time to go to town by 11 o'clock in order to see the street parade. There were 2 spring seats for the wagon. Mother and Aunt Mary chose the one which had a backrest. Father sat on the other one near the front and drove. We girls rode in the back on a quilt with hay underneath it. When we got to Cadiz, the town was full of people. It was hard to find a place to leave the wagon and team. Long lines of people had already formed along both sides of Main Street in front of the courthouse to see the parade. Our eyes widened and our hearts beat faster when we saw the elephant come plodding along. Then came the sea lions, and next came the monkeys in cages. All the vehicles were drawn by horses with spangles on their harness. These were followed by clowns and acrobats. Last came the queens of the circus, riding on a decorated wagon drawn by white horses. Their tights of pink satin and velvet were studded with spangles. Soon after the parade was over, the crowd went down the steep hill to the spring and on to the tent in the bottom, where a free exhibition was to be given. We stopped at the spring and waited our turn to use the drinking cups. We drank freely of the clear water, and further strengthened ourselves with the ample supply of sweet cakes, or tea cakes, that Aunt Mary and Mother had brought in their large satchels. The chief attraction was to be a balloon with a man in it, which would rise to such height that it would go out of sight. After some suspense on our part, and the circus manager's too, no doubt, the inflated bag did leave the ground, but it did not go very high or very far either before it fell into a clump of low bushes by the river. The great moment had come at last. Father had bought the tickets, and we were passing under the flap of the tent when we overtook Uncle Walter and his family. The man who was taking up tickets had questioned one of the boys' age. "You look at the stock these children have come from," Uncle Walter said, and that settled it, because he was 6 feet and 7 inches in his socks. Lily, Lucy, and I had seats just above our parents and the smaller children. We did not have reserved seats, but since Father knew which way the sun would travel, he chose seats in what soon would be the shadiest part of the tent. But even then we nearly smothered. The clown escorted some prim ladies to their seats, winking at the ones who were the most precise. The circus started with the sea lions tossing balls. The monkeys put on their act. The pony stood with its 4 feet on a small block. An acrobat walked a wire, while the others swung from trapeze. The women rode the white horses, and a man rode the elephant. The circus was as nearly perfect as one could wish. We forgot the heat, our thirst, and our fatigue as we sat under the magic tent. All too soon it was over, and we were back at the spring, drinking at its fount again, climbing the little hill, and then on our way home, glad when the road was shaded by the border of a patch of woods. The sun set, and the air became pleasantly cool. There was the scent of new-mown hay as we passed by the small, cleared fields. The evening star shone dimly against a pale aqua sky, and the nighthawks were sailing over the orchard, taking their supper of night-flying insects, when we stopped to put Aunt Mary and Lucy out at their house. We started on the last half-mile. Most of it was over a narrow, winding road through woods, then down an open lane to the house. When we reached home, the full moon had climbed over the trees beyond the orchard. A whippoorwill was singing its nocturnal song in the backyard at its favorite place under the outpost. Since that time, I have experienced a large number of thrills. The first time I saw a mighty river, a great lake, a large gulf, or an ocean, I felt an unforgettable sensation. Through the years, I have gone inside some of the finest cathedrals and churches. I have seen some of our largest emporiums. I have looked at million-dollar estates, and I have visited some of our largest zoological gardens with animals from all parts of the world. But nothing has ever given me quite the same thrill I felt that day as I sat under the small circus tent at Cadiz, Kentucky. Thank you for listening to Tales of Long Ago, written by Martha Thomas Sumner and read by her daughter, Gertrude Sumner Humphries.